Welcome again to the conference and to this specific session, at which I am delighted to welcome Professor Denis Feeney to give a talk titled Ovid as a Literary Historian. Denis Feeney is a Geiger Professor of Latin and Professor of Classics at Princeton University. He is also the immediate past president of the American Philological Association, which will soon, doesn't know, which will soon change its name to become Society for Classical Studies. A change that was proposed and approved during Professor Feeney's term. Professor Feeney is widely known for his work on Latin literature and Roman culture. In addition to articles on Latin literature and particularly poetry, his publications range from The Gods in Epic, Oxford 1991, and Literature and Religion at Rome, Cambridge 1998, investigating each in its own way the interaction between the literary and religious systems of Rome. To Sieber's calendar, Berkeley 2007, based on his Summer Classical Lectures of 2004, and dedicated to Roman constructions of time. As I have learned only recently, Professor Feeney is currently working on a new book in which he will try to answer the question, I quote, why Rome developed a literature in Latin when it shouldn't really have done so. I understand that his talk is part of this project, so today we have a great opportunity to hear a distinguished classicist share with us his thoughts on this fascinating topic.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Margalit, for those kind words. And I do want to thank the Society for their invitation. It's a real honor to be invited to address your society, especially since this is the very first time I've ever been to Israel. I've spent the last week driving around all over the country with some friends and with my wife. And even though it seems to me that I've seen everything in the country of Israel, nonetheless, whenever I meet anyone, they say to me, oh, have you seen this? And I say, no. And so, but you haven't seen this? This is crazy. So obviously I have to come back on many occasions to see all the other things. But I've enjoyed my week here enormously. It's been a privilege to be able to travel and to meet so many people. And I've been very touched by the hospitality and the kindness of everyone that I've met here. So warm thanks. There's a handout going around. Is that making progress up the hall? Yeah. Okay. I just want to warn everybody, we're not going to get past page 1 of the handout for about 20 minutes, so don't panic. If you start looking at your watch, you know, once we get onto page 2, the pace will accelerate, I promise. That's all right. Now, you'll see that there are many passages of Ovid starting on page 2. There are also many passages of Cicero. The reason I'm not going to get to the Ovid text for quite a while is that what I want to do is to begin by setting the scene to give a context for the vision of Ovid as a literary historian. I'm currently thinking about a book on the impact that Cicero had on the Augustan poets. And this research in many ways comes out of the book that I've just finished on how come there's literature in Latin when there shouldn't really be one. But it's in some ways the beginning of a new project trying to assess the impact that Cicero had on the generation of poets who came after him. I'm becoming more and more convinced that it would be worthwhile to entertain the hypothesis that Cicero was a major figure, a very important person for the later poets to engage with, for the way that they conceived of philosophy, politics, Roman tradition in general, and literary theory and literary history. And obviously my title today shows I'm going to concentrate on literary history. And I had no idea when I submitted my title to Yulia Ustinova that there'd be a panel on literary history earlier in today. And Andrea's wonderful paper that we heard earlier on is set the ground for what I'm going to be saying in various ways. So my lecture today is a preliminary reconnaissance into this terrain of what Cicero meant to the poets who came after him. So what I'm going to try to do today is to run by you the hypothesis that Cicero's constructions of literary history were very important for Ovid in particular, though I'll be looking at Horace as well. Now, the danger in a project like this, and I'm sure everyone has come into this kind of risk, is that you fall victim to a kind of pan-Ciceronianism. You start seeing Cicero everywhere. And I don't want to argue that. I don't want to argue in any way that Ovid was all Cicero all the time when he was thinking about literary history. As we'll see throughout the talk, there are all kinds of traditions. Some of them have been opened up to us already by Andrea earlier on. All sorts of traditions and ways of thinking about literary history that Ovid was aware of, and he was thinking about literary history and the construction of it from the very beginning of his career. So all I want to do is to argue that Cicero is an important interlocutor for him. Cicero is an important figure for him in this. I want to argue in particular that as Ovid's career went on, he got more and more interested in literary history, and especially in autobiographical literary history, as he sets his achievement as a poet, his own individual career within a backdrop, within a tradition of the Roman literary careers that he can see going before him. And this, I think, in particular, is where Cicero starts to become especially important. And I'm going to be concentrating on the dialogue between Ovid's autobiographical literary history and Cicero's autobiographical literary histories. So Cicero's literary history will become more important towards the end of my talk and the end of Ovid's career, because the end phases of Ovid's writing on literary history are, I think, deeply indebted, in particular to Cicero's Brutus, which is a pioneering work of literary history and literary theory, and that Brutus was itself written emphatically under the sign of the end. So as I said, my interest in Ovid's debt to Cicero as a literary historian is part of a general interest in Cicero's influence on the Augustan poets. And so I'll just give a quick sketch here of what my preliminary thoughts are on this very large topic. For many years, I've had the working assumption that Cicero's impact on these people must have been absolutely massive. And for years, as Froma perhaps knows, I've been trying to encourage my graduate students to work on this or to work on bits of it, and none of them have, so I thought I'd do it myself, or try to. So the larger background is the impact that he had on the Augustan poets, on Horace and Virgil in the first instance, but also on Ovid, in their thinking and in their writing on a wide range of issues. And all of these issues come under the large umbrella of Rome's relationship with Greece, Roman cultural interactions with Greece and Greek culture. And Cicero, of course, was a pioneer in theorizing that interaction. So the idea is to try and recover Cicero as a literary and an intellectual challenge for those poets, someone that they work with. The poets are not just being influenced by Cicero or learning from him. They're finding him a challenging and a rewarding predecessor and interlocutor in the hard work of constructing a Roman-Greek culture. So the world that Virgil and Horace grew up in was a Ciceronian world. When Cicero published his masterpieces on rhetoric and political philosophy in the late 50s, the De Republica and the De Oratore, Virgil was in his late teens. When Cicero was producing his unparalleled torrent of publications on philosophy, rhetoric, and literary history between February 45 and November 44, Horace was in his late teens and his early 20s, and he's studying at Athens with Cicero's son. So my historical novel would be Horace, at the age of 20, going around to visit young Cicero, who's suffering from a hangover. Of course, young Cicero became one of Rome's great drunks, and that's something that begins when you're an undergraduate. So I can imagine Horace turning up and young Cicero saying, "Oh, my father sent me another bunch of stuff," and Horace saying, "Well, can I borrow it?" And anyway, that's in my novel. So Virgil is only 5 years older than this during this amazing burst of productivity from Cicero, and he's studying in Naples. And I remember some years ago discussing this with Michael Winterbottom at Oxford, and Michael pointed out that this is an incredibly impressionable age for bookish people. The things you read when you're 19, 20, 21, 22 stay with you for the rest of your life. Ovid, of course, was born only 9 months before Cicero was murdered, and Cicero's intellectual legacy was just part of Ovid's equipment from the time that he began to be aware that there was such a thing as an intellectual world. So it seems to me worth testing the hypothesis that Cicero's output was formative for the Augustan poets. And it's actually, I know this is a thing that everyone always says, but it is actually surprising how little work there has been done on this subject until quite recently. And this is surprising, considering that up until the youth of Virgil and Horace, no one had achieved in the Latin language anything remotely comparable in range and ambition compared to what Cicero had managed to do. So Edward Frankel's book on Cicero, for example, published in on Horace, published in 1957, mentions Cicero only once in the General Index, because they had a friend in common, Trebatius. Brink's great commentaries on Horace's literary epistles are consistently disparaging about the importance of Cicero. He knows all the Ciceronian passages, of course, he knows everything, and he'll quote them, but then he'll say, this actually isn't very important. But I do believe that he underrates how important Cicero was to Horace's entire understanding of what a Roman literary history should look like. The same is more or less true of Virgil. Niklas Holzberg's superb new third edition bibliography on the Aeneid has got only 7 entries under Intertextualität Cicero. That's 2 fewer than Humor on the same page. So it seems that scholars think there's less Cicero in the Aeneid than there is humor. So modern scholars have tended to underplay the possibility of real dialogue with Cicero and the Augustan poets, but the ancient tradition wanted to see links. This is the first item on your handout. This bizarre story that Servius gives us in his commentary at the beginning of Eclogue 6, where he says, it is moreover said that Eclogue 6 was recited by Virgil to gigantic acclaim, so much so that when Cytheris, the courtesan, whom he calls Lycoris in the last poem in Eclogue 10, had chanted, or however you want to recite, cantaset, the poem, the eclogue in the theatre later on, Cicero asked in amazement whose it was. And when at length on one occasion he, Cicero, saw him, Virgil, Cicero is said to have said in praise of both himself and Virgil, the second hope of mighty Rome. Magnae spes altera Romae. Later on Virgil transferred this expression to Ascanius, as the commentators say. Now there is no chance whatsoever that this story is true, but Cicero and Virgil are the great culture heroes of the Roman classroom, so there's a very strong urge to link them. It's a bit like the story that Virgil assumed the toga virilis on the day that Lucretius died. It's a succession story. You get the great predecessor figure who dies, but the younger one, the inheritor, the heir, just comes into the vision of the older one. We should bear this in mind when we come later on to Ovid's claim, Virgilium vidi tantum, Virgil I saw and no more. This looks very modest, but it's actually quite an arrogant claim if we situate it within this literary historical tradition, that he is the successor to Virgil and he only just managed to see him, but that's appropriate, that's right. They didn't compete. So at the moment, a lot of my thinking about these issues is basically founded on hunch. In some areas, it's a fairly strong hunch. As far as the impact of Cicero's philosophical work is concerned, Margaret Hubbard already asked in 1975 where Virgil and his peers turned to in order to educate themselves in Hellenistic philosophy. And her question bears repeating. I mean, the prose of Epicurus and Chrysippus was famously bad and boring. In the case of Epicurus, deliberately so, apparently. And she says, Virgil and Horace want to learn about Hellenistic philosophy. Is that going to be their first point of recourse? Rather than page after page after page of much, much more than the basics in the most beautiful Latin that anyone had ever written. Now, I don't want to say that they didn't steel themselves to sit down and read Chrysippus. I'm sure they did. But I'm sure they read Cicero. And I'm sure that Cicero provided a fundamental point of orientation for them in their thinking about Hellenistic philosophy. And there has been quite a bit of important work done on this question, on the impact of Cicero's philosophy on the poets, from John Moles on Cicero's presence in Horace's first book of epistles, to Emily Gowers on Cicero in the first book of Horace's satires, to Roy Gibson on the influence of Cicero's De Officiis on Horace's odes. And any of these references that I mention, you'll find at the back of the handout. So I think it'd be worth investigating the degree to which the poets' whole conception of philosophy at Rome is a Ciceronian one, for it seems to me likely that they will have been struck above all by Cicero's sustained investigation of how Greek philosophy can be put to work in the very different environment of Rome, and of what kinds of adaptation and translations are required in that process. And there's another possible area of debt that I'd like to investigate one day. Cicero was Rome's first major theorist of translation, which means he was the first major theorist of translation. Cicero's achievement of assimilating Greek intellectual culture for a new Roman context is one that must have implications for how the Augustan poets conceive of their own epic and lyric projects of large-scale cultural transference. After all, this is the leading theme of the Aeneid and the Metamorphoses and the Fasti. And Cicero regularly speaks of Greece as now played out, with the torch passing to the Romans. This is what Gildenhard and Zissos mean in their article on Ovid's Metamorphoses, when they say that, I quote, Ovid's conceptual treatment of Greece is not so much Horatian as Ciceronian, the Horatian vision being, Graecia capta ferum victoriam capit, the idea that Rome was the thuggish barbarians and the Greeks came along and took them over culturally and educated them. This is the Horatian view, if you like, what they label as the Horatian view. The Ciceronian view is very different. They refer to Cicero as calling upon his fellow Romans to follow the practice of their ancestors in ripping out the literary and intellectual spoils from a weakening Hellas and transferring them to Rome. So Cicero, in other words, models a markedly competitive and aggressive relationship with Greece, one that resonates with Ovid, according to Gildenhard and Zissos, and I think they're right. So I've given you an example on the handout from the opening of the second book of the Tusculans. It's the next item, a passage that Gildenhard and Zissos referred to in their article. You see Cicero there saying, "For this reason I encourage all who have the capacity to wrest from the now failing grasp of Greece, iam languenti Graeciae eripiant, the renown won from this field of study, from philosophy." He's saying we Romans have done everything the Greeks have done and we've taken them on, there's only philosophy left, so let's do it. And then in the last section of that quotation there, you can see in the last paragraph, once these studies are transferred to ourselves, we shall have no need even of Greek libraries. So we're not going to need Greek books once we've done this job. Greek culture will be superseded once it's been properly Latinized and Romanized. This fits in very well with Gregory Hutchinson's description in his new book of the way that the Romans like to write their literary history in such a way that the vitality of Greece stops just when their own literature begins. Callimachus dies at a very convenient moment for this story, because he dies around 240, 241, 240, just at the moment that Livius Andronicus is staging the first translation of a Greek play into Latin, the conventional beginning of Latin literature. So it's easy to keep up the story that Roman literary culture is a successor to Greek. It's an inheritance of it. It's not a cadet branch of an ongoing development. Greek literature stops, Roman literature begins. Now, this is not a point of view that means much nowadays with the recent revolution in Imperial Greek and all the developments that Froma Zeitlin was mentioning in her address this morning. But if you look at curricula and reading lists until very recently, all around classic departments all over the world, you'll see that this Roman version of literary history is one that really found traction, and it's the story that we've been buying until very recently. And it's certainly a view that Ovid, as we'll see, champions in his own sketches of Greek and Roman comparative literary history. I think it would also be worth investigating Cicero's impact on political theory and political practice in Rome, because the Augustan poets are charting this terrain all the way through their work as well. It's hard, of course, to get a good fix on Cicero's contribution to political practice and political theory at Rome, partly because the damningly patronizing attitude of Mommsen and Syme has been devastating to Cicero. And I think I was quite lucky to escape this kind of upbringing. In my 5 years at Auckland University, I took a number of courses on Cicero with W.K. Lacey, who, of course, was an enormous fan of Cicero's. So I arrived in Oxford in 1977 to start my D.Phil in the unexamined knowledge that Cicero was an amazingly witty and brilliant man who counted for a lot in Roman politics, and it was a bit of a surprise to discover this was a minority view in Oxford at the time. But Cicero was an important figure in Roman politics. More significantly, for my project, he was a major political theorist and an important innovator in the protocols of Roman life during that transition from the Republic to the Principate. In the so-called Caesarean speeches, for example, we can see Cicero feeling his way towards a new kind of rhetoric, one which recognizes the new realities of power, and he tries to work with them, with all the attendant redefinitions of what used to be public and what used to be private, and how the new regime, the new protocols of power are blurring and reconfiguring those demarcations. So Cicero is the first person in Rome to systematize these problems, and he's doing it on the spot as it is happening. Jennifer Inglehart, in her introduction to her very good commentary on Augustus, on the Epistle to Augustus, Tristia, Book 2, She's got a very interesting discussion of how important Cicero's Caesarean speech, the Prologario, is to that poem, to Tristia II. She develops the parallels very convincingly. Just like his father, Julius Caesar, Augustus has got the power of clemency. The power of clemency is an arbitrary power, which is grounded in his autocratic status. For Ovid, writing from exile in 9 CE, this is the status quo. This is just the way the world is and has been for a long time. For Cicero, defending the exiled Bulgarius in late 46 BCE, it's a revolutionary situation, which he is charting systematically for the first time. And Cicero begins this speech by explicitly calling attention to the novelty of the case. The first words of the speech are novum crimen Gai Caesar et enter hunc diem non auditum. This is a new charge, Gaius Caesar, and one that had never been heard before this day. Now, a big methodological problem in all of these investigations is the problem of thinking about the kinds of models of allusion and intertextuality we need in order to work on poetry alluding to prose, or poetry working with prose. Our tools for working with poetry alluding to poetry are very good. In fact, I often think they're too good. You can give two passages of ancient literature taken more or less at random, give them to any paid-up Latinist, and he or she will be able to tell you a story about them. So we've taken this too far, I often think. But prose alluding to prose, or poetry alluding to prose, is a very different story. Here it gets much more messy. There certainly are cases where I think the Augustan poets are alluding specifically to Ciceronian language in a very meaningful way. I've given you at the bottom of page 1 of the handout some examples from Horace's first epistle, which starts off in an extremely Ciceronian way, with, I think, very direct quotation of Ciceronian language. So you see at the bottom of the page there, this famous motto from Horace Epistles 1:1, which has become the motto of the Royal Society, nullius addictus jurare in verba magistri, bound to swear an oath of allegiance to no one master, no one teacher. And this echoes, as you can see, very closely language from Cicero's Tusculans, for example, nullius qua unius disciplinae legibus ad stricti, quibus in philosophia necessario pariamus. Not bound to the laws of any one sect. I'm not going to follow any one group. I'm going to work it out for myself. At the beginning of the Natura Deorum, similarly, he says that he is aequum libero judicio nulla eius modi ad strictum necessitate. I am even on both sides. I use my own judgment. I am not bound by any necessity of that kind that would make me sign up to any one particular opinion willy-nilly. A little bit later in that same poem, you can see Horace, lines 16 to 18, nunc agilis fio, et merso civilibus undis. Now I become an active person. I get immersed in the waves of the state. I'm a guardian and an upright defender of virtue. But now, so this is how I behave some of the time, but some of the time, in Aristipi fortum praeceptor labor, but I slip back imperceptibly into the teachings of Aristippus, the hedonist. And Cicero in the Academica, book 2, he says, labor eo ut ad sentiar Epicuro ad Aristippo. I slip to the point where I start agreeing with Epicurus or Aristippus. But revocat virtus, but virtue calls me back. Or, even more, she grabs me by the hand. Horace has switched, of course. Cicero says, I start sliding into hedonism, but then virtue comes along. Horace says, I try being virtuous, but I can't help slipping back into hedonism. But the fact is that it's a very similar language, very similar pose, which Horace has flipped in a meaningful way, in exactly the fashion that we're used to seeing when poets are interacting with other poets. So we certainly do see on occasion Augustan poets alluding very precisely and meticulously to the diction and the context of Cicero. But that's actually very rare. Even when the dates are very clear, there's very, very seldom anything of this kind to show. For example, Cicero's Somnium Scipionis is extremely important, obviously, blindingly important, to Book 6 of Virgil's Aeneid. But there's nothing like this, nothing remotely like this. A couple of shared items of diction that you can hardly avoid when you're doing Platonic philosophy in Latin, but really no allusions of any importance. So the dates are regularly much more diffuse. And it looks as if intellectual history, which this is most of the time, requires different tools from poetic allusion. I'm still feeling my way here very much and trying to develop models which are going to do justice to the intensity of the engagement between these various texts, without being able to fall back on the kind of signposts and the pointers and the footnotes which we've become accustomed to when we study how poets allude to other poets. So that's some kind of overview of what look like the major issues at this preliminary stage, to give you some idea of why I think it's so important to bring some Ciceronian perspectives to bear on the way that Ovid might have conceived of literary history. Still, as I said at the beginning, I don't want to say that Ovid's literary history is all Cicero all the time. He uses a variety of different traditions, a variety of different approaches. Ovid is writing literary history from the beginning of his career. Now at last we get to page 2 of the handout. The closing poem of his very first book of poetry, the Amores, book 1, is a literary historical survey. In this first literary historical essay of his, we can see Ovid exemplifying the force of Richard Tarrant's aphorism. In his paper on Ovid and Ancient Literary History, Tarrant says, Ovid's characteristic literary historical gesture is the list. Now, the list, of course, is a favored part of Hellenistic scholarly work, one that quickly became part of the Roman tradition. The list of canonical authors became a mainstay of Hellenistic scholarship, and you can see an example on the handout of a Roman case of adapting this kind of scholarship at the bottom of page 2. This is the mini-canon of the wonderfully named Volcacius Sedigitos. This is Volcacius. And he's writing probably in the late 2nd century BCE. And what he's doing here is saying they're all, we see all kinds of people in uncertainty wrangling over this topic, which of the comic poets they should put as number 1. And he says here, I'm going to sort out this wandering, this uncertainty, this error for you, meo judicio, with my krisis. I'm going to be a kritikos. I'm going to use my critical judgment and sort it out for you. So number 1, according to him, in line 5, is Caecilius Statius. Plautus is number 2. We go through a lot of other comic poets until we hit Terence in line 10. Terence is only number 6, according to him. And at the end of this little piece, Ennius is thrown in as number 10, just because he's so revered and antique. Now, Ovid's list in Amores 115 is one that works very knowingly with this tradition, as it builds triumphantly to its famous claim that Ovid will have a name that will last as long as anyone in that list of poets going back to Homer. Now, of course, this is an amazing claim for someone in his early 20s who's only written 14 poems, but it's not so extraordinary nowadays, after all, if we reflect that of all the poets in that list that Ovid gives us, Greek and Latin, Ovid is much more famous than anyone else apart from Homer and Sophocles and Virgil. So you can see he starts with Homer in line 9. While Ida and Tenedos still stand, etc., old Homer will live. Then we have Greek poets until line 19, when he introduces Roman poets, Ennius and Archios. Ovid is here following the rules of the scholarly game, especially in not including the names of any poets who are still alive. So Virgil and Tibullus are mentioned later in that list of Roman poets, so the poem must be published after 19 BCE, because that's the year when Virgil and Tibullus both died. But Propertius and Horace aren't in here. Now, of course, part of the point, the major point of this part of the poem is to say that a good poet will have his name live on after his death. So naming living poets isn't going to help his argument very much. On the other hand, this does respect the Hellenistic convention that you do not name living artists. You can only put people in the canon when they're dead, when they're free from invidia, so you can have a balanced judgment. You see this also very clearly in Propertius 234, which is over the page, a model text for Ovid on page 3, a little bit from the end of Propertius's last poem in book 2, where you can see he mentions Varro as a love poet predecessor for him in line 85. He then goes on to mention Catullus in 87. He mentions Calvus in 89 and Gallus in 91. The point is all these people are dead. And he does not mention Tibullus, who is still alive. There are striking differences between what Propertius is doing in that little catalogue and what Ovid is doing in his catalogue. First of all, in Ovid, we get more than one genre. In Propertius, it's all love poetry. He's just talking about love poets. Ovid, on the other hand, is much more comprehensive. He includes all of the major genres, even though the climax of the poem certainly is him saying Latin love poets at the end, and I'm a continuation of that particular branch of Roman tradition. Secondly, that's one big difference with Propertius. The second big difference is that he mentions Greek poets as well as Roman poets, as well as Latin poets. This is actually very unusual in catalogues of poets in the Latin tradition. They tend to be just Roman names. But Ovid here has got Homer and Hesiod, Callimachus, Sophocles, Aratus, and Menander before he goes over to the Latin list. And you see here how Gregory Hutchinson's insight pays off, that the Romans like to think of their literary history beginning when Greek literary history stops. Callimachus is chronologically the last name on that list in Ovid's poem, and the Roman list picks up chronologically with Ennius, who was born in 239, a year or two after the death of Callimachus. Now, in Ovid's decision to have both Greek and Latin or Roman poets, I think we can probably see some influence from Cicero already, because Cicero in the Brutus does this on a much bigger scale. Cicero in the Brutus goes through all the Greek orators first, and then he turns around and goes through all the Roman ones. Ovid is very fond of these lists. I've given you a list of Ovid's lists on page 3 of the handout there. We have a lot of them. Obviously, we can't go through all these because we'd still be here at dinner time. So I'm going to skip to the end of Ovid's career and look at the view from exile. And here I'm going to be ruthless. I can't say anything in detail about his brilliant rewriting of literary history in his epistle to Augustus, for example, in Tristia 2, though that is a really intriguing list. You can see from the bit on the handout that what Ovid does in Tristia 2 is to go through a great list of Greek poets, and he uses Greek literary history as part of his self-defense. And he says, basically, how come I'm getting picked on for writing love poetry? He says the whole of Greek literature, if you look at it properly, is about love and sex. So he says, what is the Iliad all about, if not about the story of an adulteress and the passion of Achilles for the slave girl Briseis? And what's the Odyssey all about, apart from Penelope getting wooed by a whole lot of suitors, or the love affairs that Odysseus had with Circe and Calypso on his way home? And what about that scandalous story with Mars and Venus in Book 8 of the Odyssey? After epic, he works his way through Attic tragedy, and he says, what is Attic tragedy all about, apart from aberrant erotic passion? And he gives one example after another, which of course isn't hard to do. So this redescription of world literature as really being all about sex is exactly the kind of thing that used to irritate the professionals and make Latin scholars feel that Ovid was someone you couldn't take very seriously. But Ovid has got a very important point to make here. In the case of tragedy, no modern critic would dream of contesting Ovid's claim that the genre is profoundly concerned with the exploration of sexual obsession and transgression. Ovid's own tragedy Medea, which is now sadly lost, would have been a very important addition to the dossier. In the case of the Odyssey as well, Ovid looks eerily ahead of his time. Margaret Atwood's novel, The Penelopead, in 2005, put Penelope at the center of the epic and retold the story from her point of view. But a lot of modern scholarly readings of the Odyssey have been finding that Penelope was really at the center of the epic all the time. We don't need to turn Ovid into some kind of feminist avant la lettre in order to see that he's put his finger with incredible deftness on precisely the issues that have intrigued modern readers of the Odyssey. Ovid's apparently glib maneuvers reveal an Odyssey which is as much about Penelope as it is about Odysseus. So we are now living in a second Aitas Ovidiana after the medieval one, and our readings of the canon have got much more in common with Ovid's than they have with those of any other ancient author. Whatever else Ovid may be doing through this 100-line passage, he's always protesting against the dead hand of literary historical tradition. Ovid here is determined to read against the grain, but it's not just a joke or a provocation. It's a fresh and a liberating education in the uses of tradition. Anyway, I haven't got time to look at Tristia 2 in any detail, so what I want to do is to finish by looking at the two main literary historical poems from exile in which Ovid talks about his own career. As I said, it's at the end of his career that Ovid finds Cicero being more and more important. And I think this is true for Horace as well. And Horace is also an important model for Ovid, not least in how to use Cicero. In the paper on Horace's epistle to Augustus that's in your bibliography, I've already written about the importance of Cicero as a pioneer in writing literary history, especially in the Brutus, and how important this text is for Horace's epistle to Augustus. I'm confident that Horace learned a lot from Cicero about the pitfalls of comparative literary history between Rome and Greece, and about the difficult issues of periodization and teleology in literary history, problems that preoccupy modern scholars of literary history as well. In general terms, I think that Horace is constructing a series of similarities between his career and Cicero's. And now I want to suggest that Ovid's presentation of his place in Roman literary history in the exile poetry also owes a lot to Cicero and to Horace. So the Brutus is the main text here, and Cicero's Brutus is an incredibly rich and original work of scholarship and theory. Here Cicero gets hold of a number of strands of Hellenistic scholarship and reworks them in powerful ways. It's not obvious that anyone before Cicero, for example, had written a dialogue with a historical survey as its subject. There are a couple of conceivable prototypes, but I think it's highly unlikely that anyone before Cicero had written a sort of philosophical type dialogue that had a historical subject, survey of historical developments. Another of the most important of Cicero's innovations in the Brutus is the way that he makes literary history autobiographical. Cicero's history of rhetoric, which becomes a history of Roman rhetoric, is reshaped by having Cicero write himself into the trajectory of his history, especially at the end of the work, as Cicero becomes the telos of the history of oratory. As far as I can see, Cicero is the first prose author to write extensive intellectual autobiography. It's been suggested to me that Isocrates might be something of a forerunner, and I'm certainly going to have to look into that. Isocrates does have various important and interesting moments where he talks about his own career choices and career path. Now Cicero, I don't want to say that Cicero is the first Roman politician to write autobiography. That isn't the point. Many people before him had written self-justifying, defensive political memoirs of one kind or another, Rutilius Rufus and Sulla and so on. And I'm sure that in the Brutus, if we had those previous works, which of course for all intents and purposes lost, we'd be able to see the way in which Cicero is using those other works as some kind of jumping off point for his justification of his career. But so far as I've managed to find out, no orator or historian or philosopher before Cicero had written a sustained piece of artistic or intellectual autobiography of the kind that we see in the Brutus, except maybe Isocrates. Cicero may be flagging his self-awareness on this point in his ironic remarks at the beginning of his main section of autobiography in the Brutus. This is on page 4 of the handout. You see here, towards the end of the dialogue, he says, "Since it appears to be your wish," this is, he's talking to Atticus and Brutus, "to know me through and through, not just by a birthmark or a rattle, but by my whole body, I venture to include some particulars which may seem superfluous." And then he goes into a great deal of detail about the nature of his physique and what he was like as a young man and the difficulties that this presented to him as he was going through the arduous physical training that was necessary to become a good orator. And if you look above that, Plutarch's introduction to the Alexander and the Caesar, 7 or 8 lines down, the famous moment where Plutarch says, "It is not histories that I am writing, but lives. And in the most illustrious deeds, there is not always a manifestation of virtue or vice, but a slight thing, like a phrase or a jest, can be more revelatory of character." So Cicero is saying, these things may look trivial and inconsequential, but if you really want to understand me, if you really want to know me, then you need to know about these things. And if what we see in Cicero is already playing with the biographical topos that is picked up later in Plutarch, then it's possible that Cicero's irony here gets another dimension. So Cicero's autobiography is an important part of the Brutus. It's particularly original, I think. He presents his autobiography as intertwined with that of Hortensius, his slightly older contemporary. On page 5, I've given you an important section of the dialogue about this relationship with Hortensius. The dialogue, of course, begins with an evocation of the death of Hortensius, which is a very moving and interesting passage. So he's saying here at the top of page 5, section 317, he goes away to train in Asia to make himself strong, to become a good rhetorician. He comes back to Rome in the year 76. At that time, he says, when I came back from Asia, 2 orators stood out above the rest to invite my emulation, Cotta and Hortensius. And a few lines after that, he says, comparing the two, I saw that Hortensius was the man I had to do with. In warmth of style, I was more like him, and nearer in point of age, aetate conjunctior. From this section, you get a very good idea of how important the sense of time and periodization is in the Brutus. Periodization is another issue that modern scholars of literary history are extremely interested in, and it's one which pops up every now and then in ancient discussions of literary history, but it's not very common or frequent. It's a very important consideration all the way through the Brutus. What Cicero does is to group and cluster orators into different periods, aetates. And this mentality is particularly significant when he is dealing with his relationship with Hortensius. As you see in 76, he says there were 2 outstanding orators, Cotta and Hortensius. In section 333, which I've given you a little bit after that, you can see that he says that in each period, singulis aetatibus, you practically never find more than 2 great orators at any given moment. And towards the end of that section 333, after giving some examples, he says from earlier periods, then he gets down to more recent times. He mentions Paius Antonius and Crassus, afterwards Cotta and Sulpicius, and then Hortensius, nihil dico amplius, because obviously me. So he doesn't want to be too arrogant about putting himself forward as the great man with Hortensius, but that's the entire direction of this part of the dialogue. If we go back to section 318, just above that, you see a great example of how carefully he plots his time relationship with 2 great speakers of his early career. In the beginning of section 318, during the first year after my return from Asia, I pleaded some conspicuous cases. When I was candidate for the quaestorship, Cotta for the consulship, and Hortensius for the office of aedile, cum quaesturam nos consulatum Cotta aedilitatem peteret Hortensius. And this is a great illustration of the mentality that Roman politicians developed through the operation of the lex vilia annalis, which dictated the ages at which you could enter into any particular office. Roman politicians going up the tree, going through the cursus honorum, had a quasi-physical sense of where everyone in their cohort was in relation to them, the people slightly ahead of them as well, the people slightly behind them. They were able to feel this and plot people. So if I'm going for the quaestor and he's going for the aedileship and he's going for the consulship, we know instinctively what the age differences are, what the gaps are. This mentality is everywhere in the Brutus. In section 319, right after that, you can see how Cicero became top orator by defeating Hortensius in the Verres case, right at the end of that first extract on page 5. As aedile elect, I crossed swords with Hortensius. Consul elect, designatus aedilis, cum designata consule Hortensio. Now, ultimately, this interest in charting the relative ages and periods of important orators in the Brutus must go back to the kind of mentality that Andrew was showing us earlier in the day. The Hellenistic scholarship's interest in achmai and chronoi, the way in which you have age periods at which you peak at the age of 40, and if you don't really know anything about anyone's age, you say, oh, well, I guess they were 40 when they did something important. Also, as we saw in the Marmor Parium, in her presentation, the way in which political events and larger other cultural events are interrelated with the artistic or poetic events that you're interested in. Atticus's Liber Annalis, I'm convinced, must have been very important for Cicero in this respect. Somehow, we don't have the book. It's extremely frustrating. But at the beginning of the Brutus, Cicero is very polite to Atticus about the impact this book had on him. And I don't think he's just being polite. Atticus's book must have been a condensation of the kind of scholarship that Andrea was showing us. He had, I'm more and more convinced, 2 separate columns all the way through the book, one Greek, one Roman. He had the Greek archons, the Athenian archons, and then he would say Epicurus was doing this or whatever, Archilochus on one side on the Greek, and then on the Roman column, synchronized with it, you could look across and see what was happening on the Roman side. Now, this is hypothesis, and we don't have evidence, solid evidence for any work of this kind before Eusebius. But nonetheless, something about this book made a big impact on Cicero. when he read it. And Cicero's chronology, as you can see from the De Republica, for example, he's very well informed about Roman chronology and Greek chronology from Polybius and other sources. So something about this book really hit him between the eyeballs. Anyway, that's the kind of scholarship that Cicero is working with, but he's going well beyond it. Partly, he's reworking scholarship of this kind by plotting it into major currents of Roman political history, especially the social war and the civil war, which keep coming back, keep recurring, these devastating events and the impact they had on Roman political and oratorical culture. And partly, he's reworking this kind of scholarship, as I said, by making it autobiographical. And accordingly, he even carries on down to the end of his own career. Section 328, at the bottom of page 5. He's talking about Hortensius' last speech. Hortensius' career, he says, was one of success from the consulship of Crassus and Scaevola, 95 BCE, down to Paulus and Marcellus, 50 BCE. Mine was parallel to his, from the dictatorship of Sulla down to about the same time. The Loeb has got the metaphor wrong here. Nos in the Latin, nos in eodem corsu fuimus. This is a chariot racing metaphor. We were on the same lap. We were going neck and neck around the circus. The voice of Hortensius was silenced only by his own death. My voice was silenced by the death of the Republic. Which wasn't quite true, but more or less true. So I think there are many connections between these patterns in Cicero's Brutus and what we see in Horace's literary epistles, for a start. We see in the Epistle to Florus, for example, at the top of page 6 of the handout, an autobiographical passage about Horace's early life with his philosophical training at university in Athens, the disastrous impact of the Civil War, and his eventual discovery of his career as a poet. In that paper I wrote on the Epistle to Augustus, I argued that there are important Ciceronian currents at work in that poem as well, especially in the way that Horace presents himself as a lonely and misunderstood figure, someone who's under attack for his aesthetic stances, someone who can't understand the popularity of the models admired by the opposition. Cicero in the Brutus and the Orator and other works written around the same time can't understand what the Attici are on about. He just doesn't get it. Can't they see that I'm the greatest orator who's ever lived and I'm not an Atticist? And similarly, Horace can't understand this enthusiasm, this passion for the veteres, the old guard, Plautus and Ennius. Now, again, I want to guard against pan-Ciceronianism. Cicero is not the only important model for Horace in that poem by any means. Climacus is obviously an important model for a start. People are attacking me for my aesthetic judgment, and they're wrong for this reason and that reason. And as Barbara Graziosi has shown, Horace's self-presentation throughout the Epistle to Augustus is deeply involved with the traditions of Hellenistic biographies of the canonical Greek poets. As she shows, Horace is presenting himself through this filter. He's read all those biographies of Archilochus and all of those other poets. He knows what a poet's life is meant to look like, and he tailors his presentation of his own life and his own career to fit accordingly, in the light of his own knowledge that people will one day, very soon, be writing biographies of him, as was indeed the case. So I think Cicero's Brutus is also important to Ovid, especially in the two major poems from exile, in which he situates his own work within a framework of autobiography and periodization. Ovid's autobiography in Tristia 410 on page 6 of the handout starts with his birth, and he carefully locates his birth for the benefit of future scholars. Line 6 for the year, what we call 43 BCE, and lines 13 and 14 for the day and the month, corresponding to March the 20th. So this is in, line 14 and 15. Haec est ame ferae festis de quinque Minervae. Ovid says there that he always wanted to be a poet. And in line 21, you can see his father saying to the young Ovid what all the parents of our students are still saying to them. Studium quid inutile tempetas. Why are you taking such a useless course? As the rector was saying this morning, from 18% to 7%. This is what all the kids are hearing from their parents. And then the father goes on to say exactly what they say when they tell them to do engineering instead. Even Homer didn't make any money. Something we have to fight. Ovid says that he could have had a senatorial career, but his body and temperament were not up to it. That's in line 37. I wasn't strong enough. Cicero, of course, when he wasn't strong enough for a real career as an orator, went to Asia for 2 or 3 years to train and get strong and learn how to do it. Ovid gives up and becomes a poet instead. In line 41, we're now on page 7 of the handout, using language very like that of Cicero in the Brutus. In line 41, Ovid pinpoints an age cohort. Temporis ilius colui foique poetas. The poets of that time I fondly reverenced. Temporis ilius, it's like the aitas that Cicero picks out as he goes through Roman oratory. Here he's putting himself in a position relative to the greats of his youth, rather as Cicero does in the Brutus. Ovid situates Macaire, for example, as a different generation from himself in line 43. He calls Macaire mihi grandior aevo. He was older than me in age. Propertius is the great figure of Ovid's youth in line 45. Friend of his, so he says. Ovid says that he heard him recite, even though he was probably only about 15 when Propertius's first book came out. And then he goes on talking about various other people, some very controversial ones like Ponticus and Bassus. But for the most part, what he's talking about here are real players, really important people. Macaire, kind of, but Propertius, Horace, Virgil, Tibullus, and Gallus. He's doing what Cicero does in the Brutus. He's picking out the key figures in each period, and he's talking about their relationship in time to each other. So you see in lines 53 to 54, for example, when he's been talking about Tibullus, successor fuit hic tibi Galle propertius illi, quartus ab his serie temporis ipse fui. Okay, he says, that's line 53. Tibullus was your successor, Gallus, and Propertius his. After them came I, fourth in order of time. So there's no anxiety of influence here. I don't want to say there's never any anxiety of influence in Roman poetry. There is. But there isn't any here. You get a kind of image like a magistracy, various colleagues, one taking over the office from the predecessor and handing it on. And again, here too, he observes the rule that you don't mention living people. Only dead people can be under consideration when you're doing canons. This is actually, incidentally, an issue that causes quite a bit of trouble to Cicero when he's writing the Brutus in the spring of 46, because the Battle of Thapsus took place in April of that year, and you can see Cicero readjusting, so I can't talk about this guy, and then news comes, oh, he's dead, okay, I can get him in. So it's a strange instant reflex reaction to this tradition. One very big difference in this poem is that Ovid has not got a peer, as Hortensius was for Cicero, or as Virgil and Varius were for Horace. In line 55, Ovid says, you can see, Utque ego maiores, sic me coluere minores. As I reverence the older poets, so was I reverenced by the younger ones. Ovid represents himself by implication as the sole standout figure of his aitas. In fact, he contrives to give the impression that he's the sole standout figure of his aitas in two genres. He's the successor to Propertius in the tradition of love poetry, and he's also the successor to Virgil in the tradition of epic as the poet of the Metamorphoses. Again, this is perhaps a lot to read into that little line Virgilium vidi tantum, which we see in this poem. But I think if we think of the claim to literary tradition of the master and his heir who only just glimpse each other, we can see how important those words are to Ovid. At the end of the poem, in line 125, Ovid returns to this language of periodization. Line 125 after the dots there, nam tolerant manios cum saecula nostra poetas. For although this age of ours has brought forth mighty poets, then he carries on, here saecula nostra is broader than aitas. He means the whole span of time from Virgil down to him. So in Tristia 410, we have an autobiography where time relations matter a lot, where important predecessors get their due measure, and where the author is slotted in to the right kind of relationship in time and influence with his predecessors. And again, I think this is a very Ciceronian way of conceiving of literary history. Ovid's other exilic poetic catalogue poem, Ex Ponto 416, may look rather similar on the surface, but it's in fact very different. This starts at the bottom of page 7 of your handout. Invide quid laceras nasones carmine carpis. instead of the canonical and revered figures that we saw in the earlier poem, here, the last poem that Ovid ever wrote, almost certainly, we get a plethora of non-entities. You could set a master's exam by giving this poem to the candidates and asking them to identify the people that Ovid is talking about here, because they won't have heard of any of them, or maybe one or two. This poem reinforces even more strongly than Tristia 4:10 the idea that Ovid is the only significant figure of his age. The only poet of any real standing mentioned in this poem is Macaire in line 6, the guy that he mentioned in the earlier poem as well. Possibly Varius, the friend of Virgil and of Horace, the poet of the tragedy Thyestes. You'll find him in line 31, at the top of page 8. But you'll miss him if you're not careful. Cum Varius, that's it. In fact, I agree with Martin Heltzler in his commentary on this poem that this is not the famous Varius. In fact, the transmitted text is Varus, which doesn't scan, and Heltzler prints this with an obelisk. He says we don't know who this person is. And one of the main reasons that I agree with Heltzler is that Heltzler says it can't be the famous Varius because the famous Varius has been dead for a very long time. And all of the people in this list, apart from one guy who's mentioned in line 16, appear to be still alive. And this is odd. Ovid is flipping the rules. He's talking about all these living poets now, all of a sudden. And I think Heltzler puts his finger on the issue here. He says, it's very important that Ovid has, I quote, transformed the standard catalogue of dead predecessors into a catalogue of living contemporaries. The poet, on the contrary, is not alive anymore, but presents himself as dead. So that's Heltzler. And the reason that Ovid is dead is because he's in exile. And he's transformed exile into a kind of living death. So Ovid is the great dead classic, with all of these non-entities still alive, even if they're not alive and kicking. All the real talent, the other really dead classics, the really great poets of the Roman tradition are sitting, the dead ones, are sitting anonymously in lines 37 to 38, as you can see. While there were others, all of whose names it were long for me to mention, that's it, that's Virgil, Propertius, everybody is in there. It's a very different perspective from the earlier poem and from the Brutus. The only link that you could maybe establish with the Brutus is the address to Cotta Maximus starting in line 41. You see in line 41 of Ovid's poem, Te tamen in turba non ausum Cotta silere. I wouldn't dare to be silent about you, Cotta, among the turba, the crowd, the throng of other people. And this reminds me very much of the end of the Brutus, where Cicero turns to Brutus and says, as you can see in the last item on the handout, I grieve more deeply when I look on you, Brutus, whose youthful career, faring in triumph amidst the general applause, has been thwarted by the onset of a malign fortune. The end of Libertas. Again, I think the Loeb translation misses the metaphor. This is another chariot racing metaphor. This isn't a triumph. If you see the Latin, per medias laudes quasi quadrigis verhentem, through the middle of the applause, as if driving in a chariot, but he's not a triumphal general. Transversa incurret misera fortuna rei publicae. He's been sideswiped by another chariot as he's going along. This misera fortuna goes into him and he crashes. So I had this on the brain because I was in Caesarea yesterday walking up and down the hippodrome and seeing that for the first time. So perhaps we have a debt to the Cicero here. Among the throng of unnamed people that you're not going to mention, there is one outstanding talent, one outstanding individual whom you might mention. Otherwise, in Ovid's last poem, we see no chronological order, no pattern, no chain of succession, just a list of people who don't really matter. There are no meaningful contours to the presentation here, no periodization. It reminds me very much of Gareth Williams' excellent remarks on the way that conventional markers of Roman time become redundant in the exile poetry. As Gareth Williams says, I quote, "The Roman birthday as a marker of time and progress in life is redundant in exile, where Ovid's existence lacks all positive development and the years merge into each other without meaningful distinction." So this final poem, Ex Ponto 416, the last poem he wrote, is a very bitter version of the literary histories of Horace and Cicero. But even in its bitterness, Ovid's presentation of his place in Roman literary history and the exile poetry owes a great deal both to Horace and especially to Horace's Cicero. Cicero and Horace and Ovid all end up positioning themselves as isolated and misunderstood figures, last survivors of a great generation, the last men standing, living on beyond their time, forced to defend their art against pygmies. Thank you.